Ever wondered what happens when survival becomes a daily game of Russian roulette? In Con Thien Hell on Angels Hill, we're going to explore how a small hill in Vietnam became the epicenter of one of the most brutal battles of the American War. Forget what you think you know about military strategy and heroism. What happened at Con Thien was a true meat grinder for the soldiers, where courage and despair mixed with every single bombardment. And the most surprising thing? The impact of this battle still resonates today, shaping what we understand about sacrifice and resilience. If you've ever wondered how ordinary men coped with inhumane conditions and decisions that seemed absurd, this video is for you. Why did they call Con Thien Angel's Hill? What's the truth about the war strategies employed there? More than just historical facts, this video reveals powerful lessons in leadership, survival, and the real cost of defending an ideal amidst chaos. So stick with us until the end, because you're going to discover the secrets behind one of the most symbolic battles of the Vietnam War, and how they can change your view on sacrifice, strategy, and perseverance. Ready to challenge what you believe about war? Let's get started. Con Thien, a small hill just 3 kilometers, about 2 miles from the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, stood out as a symbol of American resistance during the Vietnam War. This strategically crucial location was a fortified position that served as both an observation point and a blocking force against the advances of the North Vietnamese Army NVA. However, this advantageous location came at a steep cost. The soldiers defending the so-called Angel's Hill faced relentless attacks and almost unbearable living conditions. The irony of the name Angel's Hill was not lost on those who were there. For many, the place felt more like purgatory than a heavenly refuge. The Marines who occupied Con Thien quickly realized that the position, while strategic, was extremely vulnerable. With enemy artillery just a few kilometers away, the location became the target of constant shelling, especially between May and September 1967, when more than 3,000 rounds hit the area in a single week. This intensity of fire turned the hill into a true meat grinder, an expression used by the soldiers themselves to describe the physical and psychological impact of being under continuous attack. Many veterans report that survival depended as much on combat skills as on the ability to endure fear and extreme fatigue. The routine at Con Thien was marked by a relentless cycle of tension and resistance. During the day, the soldiers worked to fortify their positions and monitor enemy movements. At night, they faced ambushes and sporadic bombardments that seemed never to cease. The mud, a result of the torrential rains common in the region, was another constant enemy, hindering not only movement but also basic hygiene. In such adverse situations, camaraderie among the soldiers became essential to maintaining morale. Stories of friendship and sacrifice abound among the veterans, many of whom never forgot the colleagues they lost on Angel's Hill. Con Thien was not just a battlefield, but also a laboratory for war strategies in extreme conditions. The location provided a privileged view of the DMZ, allowing American forces to monitor NVA movements. However, this advantage also made Con Thien a high-priority target. The North Vietnamese Army understood that controlling or neutralizing the hill could shift the balance of power in the region. For this reason, attacks like the massive assault on May 8, 1967, became frequent, each one more ferocious than the last. The American response was equally vigorous, with operations like Hickory and Kingfisher designed to repel the enemy and maintain the position. The experiences lived by the soldiers at Con Thien generated lessons that go beyond the battlefield. Many learned firsthand the importance of adaptation and resilience, essential characteristics not only in war, but also in any crisis situation. As an example, the improvised defense tactics developed there directly influenced other campaigns in the American War. It's interesting to note how a battle on a small hill in Vietnam had such a profound impact on subsequent military operations, both in terms of strategy and psychological preparation. These events also serve as a reminder that war is not just a contest of strength, but also of will and endurance. Despite the brutal conditions, Con Thien became a symbol of heroism for those who served there. Many soldiers refer to the experience as a turning point in their lives, marking a before and after in their perception of courage and sacrifice. To understand the dimension of what Con Thien was, you have to imagine yourself in a place where every second is permeated by uncertainty and imminent danger. Still, the hill stood firm, thanks to the determination of the Marines and the American strategy. And like every war story, what began at Con Thien did not end there. The next chapter of this saga would be written on another battlefield, but the lessons learned would echo for a long time. The Marines who occupied Con Thien faced a scenario that transcended the limits of human endurance. Constant shelling, combined with regular ambushes and extreme weather conditions, made the location a true meat grinder. This expression, widely used by the soldiers, reflected the brutality of everyday life. It was a place where survival depended not only on tactical skill, but also on unparalleled mental fortitude. Imagine living days on end in muddy trenches, certain that every second could be your last. That was the reality for those who served there. Ground attacks by the NVA added an even more terrifying layer to the routine of soldiers at Con Thien. The enemy was known for their persistence and ingenuity, often using tunnels and camouflage to launch surprise attacks. A striking example occurred in May 1967, when Vietnamese troops launched a massive assault that nearly breached the American defenses. Although repelled with great effort, the Marines suffered heavy casualties, reinforcing the feeling that the position was as dangerous as it was essential. For many, the nights at Con Thien were a mixture of extreme vigilance and anticipation of confrontation. Con Thien's vulnerability was exacerbated by its proximity to the DMZ, a region full of natural hiding places for enemy forces. The artillery bombardments coming from North Vietnam were frequent and devastating, making constant fear a part of everyday life. Many soldiers described the sound of the shells as something they never forgot, a sound that echoed even years after the end of the war. Despite this, the determination of the Marines to hold the position was unwavering, showing how American war strategy often depended on individual courage. In addition to the challenges posed by the enemy, the soldiers at Con Thien faced significant logistical difficulties. The transport of supplies was limited due to the risks, and basic items such as food, water, and medicine were often scarce. On some occasions, the shortage forced soldiers to improvise, such as reusing materials or creating creative solutions to protect themselves from shelling. This improvisation, although necessary, increased physical and emotional exhaustion. Even so, the camaraderie among the soldiers was an element that kept them together. Many accounts highlight how small gestures of solidarity helped alleviate the weight of the situation. Interestingly, the constant shelling at Con Thien transformed the location into a testing ground for American war strategies. An example of this was the intensive use of air support, both to eliminate enemy positions and to supply the soldiers. Helicopters became a lifeline, bringing supplies and evacuating the wounded under enemy fire. This dependence on air logistics directly influenced other campaigns in the Vietnam War, showing how the lessons learned in places like Con Thien shaped the broader military approach. Despite the suffering and losses, Con Thien became a symbol of the determination of the American Marines. The position, although exposed, was defended with unwavering tenacity, which served as a clear message to the NVA that American forces would not retreat easily. However, while Con Thien remained a strategic point, other challenges were emerging in the American war, and the next step would be to face a new dynamic of combat and resistance. Lieutenant General Lewis Walt, known for his practical approach and leadership on the battlefield, received a mission that tested his patience and strategic beliefs. The plan, conceived by authorities in Washington and led by Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara, was to create a barrier to block the flow of troops and materials from North Vietnam to the south. The idea seemed simple on paper, a combination of landmines, barbed wire, and troops positioned along the DMZ. However, for Walt, an experienced commander, the proposal had glaring flaws, both in its conception and in its practical execution. Washington's strategic vision seemed disconnected from the realities of the terrain. Walt was not alone in his concerns. Many military personnel on the front lines shared his view that building a barrier was a static solution to a dynamic problem. Admiral U.S. Grant Sharp, responsible for forces in the Pacific, was one of the first to criticize the idea, pointing out the exorbitant cost and logistical challenges involved. For Walt and his Marines, the issue was clear. A mobile and flexible force would be much more effective in dealing with enemy infiltration. The rugged terrain and the adaptable tactics of the NVA made it unlikely that a fixed barrier could stop the movements. As he well knew, the Vietnam War was a game of chess, not walls. Still, politics often trumped practicality. McNamara, convinced by the proposal of academics like Roger Fisher of Harvard, insisted on the project. In September 1966, the Jason Group presented a revised version of the plan. which included air support to monitor the barrier. This adaptation seemed to partially address the criticisms, but Walt remained skeptical. He knew that building such a structure would require not only substantial resources, but also a constant dedication to keeping it functional under attack. The idea that a barrier could block the flow of 15 NVA battalions was, in Walt's view, a war strategy disconnected from reality. The challenge of implementing the plan fell to Army General Alfred D. Starbird, who led Task Force 728. In April 1967, the project began to take shape with the opening of a 200-meter, about 650 feet wide corridor, known as the Trace, which stretched between Jiulin and Con Thien. This corridor represented only part of the effort, but it already faced significant difficulties. American forces found that maintaining a cohesive line of defense in such a hostile environment was a monumental task. Every meter of advance required enormous logistical effort and faced fierce resistance from enemy troops. Interestingly, the barrier project served not only as a containment strategy, but also as a field for tactical experimentation. Throughout its construction, commanders on the ground adjusted their approaches to respond to changes in NVA tactics. For example, the use of sensors to detect enemy movements became an innovation that would influence future campaigns. However, the barrier never worked as intended. Despite the colossal effort, the NVA proved ingenious in finding ways to circumvent it, exposing the fragility of a purely static approach in such a fluid war. For Walt, the project was a frustrating reminder of how decisions made far from the battlefield could compromise real operations. He and his men knew that the American war in Vietnam required flexibility and creativity above all else. Even so, the construction of the barrier continued, fueling debates about the effectiveness of American strategies in the region. Meanwhile, the challenges at Con Thien and other points along the DMZ revealed that the war was far from being defined by a single approach. The strongpoint obstacle system, proposed as part of the defensive barrier in the demilitarized zone, represented an ambitious military engineering effort. The central idea was to establish fortified positions along the route, combining landmines, barbed wire, and strategically stationed troops to disrupt the flow of enemy supplies and soldiers. Con Thien, as one of the key positions, was a focal point of this strategy. Despite the logic behind the plan, its execution encountered a series of challenges that tested the limits of American forces. From the outset, it became clear that the rugged geography and harsh climate of the region would be as challenging as the enemy itself. One of the initial obstacles was the logistical impact of the project. Each strongpoint demanded immense resources for its construction and upkeep, including a constant supply of materials and soldiers. For example, Con Thien and other positions required a continuous flow of ammunition, equipment, and reinforcements, often transported under the threat of enemy attacks. Torrential rain, which turned the terrain into mud, further hampered operations. Military engineers had to contend not only with nature but also with regular shelling from the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, which aimed to weaken the infrastructure even before it was completed. Resistance to the plan didn't come solely from the enemy. Within the American forces themselves, many officers questioned the effectiveness of a static barrier in such a fluid conflict. The NVA had already demonstrated its ability to bypass physical obstacles, using tunnel networks and hidden trails to avoid fortified positions. This perception fueled debate among commanders about the viability of the strongpoint obstacle system. One of the most vocal critics, Admiral U.S. Grant Sharp, warned that the human and material cost of the project might not outweigh the expected benefits. Many shared the opinion that a mobile force, capable of responding quickly to enemy incursions, would be more effective. Still, McNamara and his supporters insisted on moving forward with the project. To address the challenges, technological innovations like motion sensors and aerial patrols were incorporated. These elements helped monitor NVA movements but also introduced new complications. Sensors frequently malfunctioned due to weather conditions, and air support, while valuable, was limited by the presence of enemy anti-aircraft artillery. The pressure to make the project functional led to constant adjustments, but also exposed the vulnerability of American forces to an enemy that learned quickly and adapted its tactics in real time. Meanwhile, troop morale at locations like Con Thien began to suffer from the daily hardships. Soldiers serving in these areas faced not only imminent danger, but also the accumulated fatigue of living under bombardment and in adverse conditions. Veteran accounts indicate that the idea of strong points often seemed like a euphemism for easy targets. However, the camaraderie among the troops and the determination to protect their fellow soldiers kept resistance alive. These men knew that each day they spent defending the barrier was a message of resilience, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. In the end, the strongpoint obstacle system highlighted the complexities of trying to adapt conventional strategies to an asymmetric conflict like the American war in Vietnam. Although the challenges encountered during its implementation limited its effectiveness, the project served as a valuable lesson about the difficulties of aligning military tactics with political objectives. And, while the focus remained on the barrier, other battles unfolded along the DMZ, demanding new strategies and sacrifices from the soldiers on the ground. Con Thien, located just 3 kilometers from the demilitarized zone, DMZ, stood out as a vital strategic point for American forces during the Vietnam War. Due to its elevation, the hill offered a crucial panoramic view of North Vietnamese Army, NVA, movements along the region. This advantageous position allowed for monitoring enemy infiltration and directing attacks with greater precision, making Con Thien a key piece in the defense of the DMZ. However, the same advantage that made the hill valuable also turned it into a high-priority target. For the NVA, neutralizing Con Thien meant opening the way for more aggressive operations in the south. Con Thien's importance was reinforced by its connection to the Trace, the 200-meter-wide corridor created as part of the strongpoint obstacle system. Serving as one of the main points of this defensive line, the hill became a bastion for American forces. Infantrymen from the 3rd Marine Division rotated to protect the site, a job that would soon become known as time in the barrel. The expression reflected not only the rotation of soldiers, but also the constant danger and psychological strain faced by those defending the position. For many, Con Thien was a microcosm of the war, a place where survival depended on courage, endurance, and adaptation to unimaginable conditions. The terrain around Con Thien presented challenges for both defenders and attackers. The proximity to the DMZ gave the NVA easy access to bombard the hill with heavy artillery, while the rugged terrain hindered American logistics. During the monsoons, the rains turned the ground into thick mud, further complicating the movement of troops and vehicles. Still, the position was held at all costs, as its fall would be a devastating blow to American operations in the region. The symbolism of holding Con Thien firm was not only military but also psychological. It showed the enemy that American forces were willing to fight to the end. The nickname Hill of Angels, derived from the Vietnamese meaning of Con Thien, had an unsettling duality for the soldiers who served there. On one hand, the name evoked hope and protection, but on the other, it reflected the sacrifice of those who lost their lives defending the site. Many veterans described the experience at Con Thien as a baptism by fire, a place that not only tested combat skills, but also challenged sanity. The constant pressure of bombardments, ambushes, and extreme living conditions made the hill a unique battlefield, where each soldier needed to face his own demons. War strategies in Con Thien often depended on the integration of ground and air support. Helicopters played a crucial role in transporting supplies and evacuating the wounded, while airstrikes were used to neutralize enemy artillery positions. This combination of forces symbolized the American approach of technological warfare, contrasting with the asymmetric and guerrilla tactics of the NVA. However, challenges persisted. Even with advanced technology, the NVA adapted quickly, using geography and camouflage techniques to minimize their losses and continue the pressure on Con Thien. Despite its strategic importance, Con Thien was also a reminder of the limitations of any fixed defensive position in a war as fluid as the one in Vietnam. The hill endured not only because of its location, but mainly because of the determination of the soldiers who defended it. Each day at Con Thien was a battle for survival, but also a battle for control of a larger narrative, that the American war would not be won easily. As the conflict around the DMZ intensified, Con Thien remained a symbol of resilience, but the fight was far from over. Con Thien became a fierce battlefield during the Vietnam War, a constant target of attacks by the North Vietnamese Army, NVA. The hill's proximity to the demilitarized zone, DMZ, facilitated the almost incessant shelling of American positions. One of the most intense moments occurred on May 8, 1967, when the NVA launched a massive attack that tested the Marines' defenses to the limit. Although the Americans succeeded in repelling the assault, casualties were significant, both in human and logistical terms. For many soldiers, each battle in Con Thien was a harsh lesson about the relentless nature of the American war in Vietnam. The American response to the NVA attacks was no less vigorous. Operations like Hickory, Buffalo, and Kingfisher were launched to protect Con Thien and neutralize enemy forces in the region. Operation Hickory, in particular, represented an offensive approach to push the NVA away from the DMZ. Despite initial success, these operations often resulted in brutal confrontations, exposing American forces to well-coordinated ambushes. The battles were intense and often fought on difficult terrain, where the climate and geography favored the enemy. Even so, these offensives showed the determination of American commanders to keep the hill under control. The incessant shelling turned Con Thien into one of the most battered locations of the war. Between September 19th and 27th, 1967, more than 3,000 projectiles fell on the position, causing significant destruction and immense psychological impact on the soldiers. The continuous sound of gunfire, the smell of gunpowder, and the sight of craters became part of everyday life. Many veterans report that living under these conditions was like facing a waking nightmare. Still, the resilience of the Marines was remarkable, and their perseverance inspired new strategic approaches in the conflict. Despite the suffering, Con Thien also stood out as a field of tactical innovation. The integration of airstrikes with ground operations was widely employed to confront the NVA. For example, the use of helicopters to evacuate the wounded and provide supplies became a crucial element in the survival of the soldiers. In addition, coordinated artillery strikes helped weaken enemy positions before American advances. This reliance on advanced technology and logistics became a trademark of the American war in Vietnam, albeit limited by the adaptability of enemy forces. The NVA attacks were meticulously planned, exploiting every perceived weakness in American defenses. The use of tunnels, camouflage, and guerrilla tactics allowed the enemy to attack quickly and retreat before suffering heavy losses. In Con Thien, the NVA often launched night attacks, taking advantage of the darkness to disorient the defenses. These attacks were accompanied by diversionary bombardments, creating a chaotic environment for the American soldiers. However, the discipline and training of the Marines often prevailed, resulting in heavy losses for the NVA in direct confrontations. Although the continuous shelling and attacks took a heavy toll on both sides, they also highlighted the strategic importance of Con Thien. For the NVA, the goal was to make the position untenable, while for the Americans, keeping it meant controlling a vital piece on the DMZ chessboard. Each battle fought, there was a reminder of the high price of war, but also of the determination of both sides to achieve their goals. Meanwhile, new military operations were being planned, expanding the scope and intensity of the conflict in the region. Con Thien remains one of the most symbolic landmarks of the Vietnam War, representing both the resilience of American soldiers and the brutality of a conflict that marked a generation. For the Marines who served there, the experience was unforgettable, not only because of the extreme conditions, but also because of the unbreakable bond formed between comrades. The trenches of the Hill of Angels were more than defensive positions. They were survival scenarios where each soldier depended on the other to face the constant shelling, the incessant mud, and the omnipresent fear. These experiences shaped the character and memories of those who survived, but also left deep scars. The psychological impact of Con Thien was immense. Many soldiers suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, carrying the horrors of war far beyond the battlefield. The constant threat of death and the isolation imposed by the adverse conditions left lasting marks. Some veterans describe Con Thien as a breaking point, a place where time seemed to freeze and survival became the only objective. However, for many, the act of resisting in the face of such extreme adversity became a symbol of strength. This duality, the trauma and the courage, encapsulates the emotional legacy of this hill. Beyond individual issues, Con Thien also left valuable lessons for American military strategy. The experiences lived there influenced the approach to later conflicts, highlighting the importance of tactical flexibility and integration of forces. For example, the reliance on air support in Con Thien shaped the use of helicopters in future operations, while innovations in sensors and logistics were refined to become more effective. Although the defensive barrier as a whole was considered a failure in strategic terms, The adaptations made in the heat of battle demonstrated the potential for learning in extreme situations. The symbolism of Con Thien transcends its military importance. For many veterans, the hill is an unofficial memorial to those who gave their lives defending the site. The Hill of Angels not only witnessed sacrifices but also acts of heroism that inspired those who fought side by side. Stories like that of soldiers who risked their lives to save comrades under enemy fire have become part of the collective memory of the war. This sense of brotherhood, forged in unimaginable circumstances, remains one of the most moving aspects of the legacy of Con Thien. The suffering experienced in Con Thien also highlighted the limits of military power in achieving political objectives. Despite the bravery shown by the soldiers, the American war in Vietnam continued to be marked by controversial strategic decisions and the disconnect between commanders in Washington and the fighters in the field. Con Thien symbolizes this dilemma, a vital position, but one that in the end exposed the complexities of an asymmetric war. The lessons learned there were not only technical, but also ethical and political, leading many to reflect on the human cost of the conflict. For the soldiers who fought and survived, Con Thien became a defining point, marking the before and after in their lives. Many returned with stories illustrating both the brutality and the humanity of war. The Hill of Angels remains in memory as a place of sacrifice, but also of resilience. And while other battles unfolded in Vietnam, the legacy of Con Thien continued to echo, reminding everyone of the price paid for every meter of ground defended. And now, after everything you've seen about Hell on Angels Hill, I ask you, what would you do in the place of these soldiers? How would you handle life or death decisions amidst the chaos? The story of Con Thien isn't just about war, but about human endurance, and how even in the most extreme conditions, strategy and determination make all the difference. Can you identify the parallels between these battles and the challenges we face today? Think about it. How do the lessons learned in the Vietnam War still echo in the strategies and decisions that shape the current world? If you're intrigued, there's much more to discover about the history of American wars, and this is just the beginning. So, subscribe now to American War and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss any new analysis or surprising stories that bring clarity to the past and the impact it still has on the present. Leave in the comments what struck you most in this video and which battle you would like to explore in the future. Let's continue to unravel together the secrets that history books don't always tell. See you in the next video.